August 15th, 1971. In a calm, rehearsed tone, President Richard Nixon tells the American people he's taking temporary action to protect the dollar. What he doesn't say outright is that he just killed the gold standard and changed the course of economic history. From that moment on, the US dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by belief gold would triple, inflation would explode, and the American dollar, once the world's most trusted currency, would become a slow burning liability. But was this a historic blunder, or the most calculated move in the rise of a financial empire? You're watching Gilded, where we chase the metal, not the hype. The system that Nixon dismantled had been born in 1944, at the tail end of World War II. In a quiet town called Bretton Woods, 44 nations met to create a global financial structure that could stabilize the post-war world. At the center of it all was the United States, the only industrial power left unscathed by war, and the only one holding two-thirds of the world's gold. The agreement was simple. Other countries would peg their currencies to the US dollar, and the US dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. It was elegant, and on paper, it worked. Foreign central banks could redeem dollars for gold, but American citizens couldn't. The result? The dollar became the de facto global reserve currency, backed, at least in theory, by gold stored in US vaults. But behind the polished speeches and confident smiles, something was already starting to crack. Throughout the 1960s, the US government was spending more than it earned. The Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, a ballooning budget deficit. To cover the gap, the US printed more dollars, but it didn't increase its gold reserves to match, and foreign governments noticed. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, began redeeming its dollar holdings for gold, pulling literal tons of bullion out of American vaults and shipping it back to Europe. Other nations followed suit, quietly, systematically, and the US gold supply began to bleed. The American government had created more paper than it had metal to back it up, and foreign nations were calling its bluff. If everyone redeemed their dollars at once, the US would run out of gold. Fast. So Nixon made a move. He suspended convertibility. Officially, it was just a temporary measure. Unofficially, it was default. From that moment forward, the dollar was no longer tied to gold. The Bretton Woods system collapsed, and the era of fiat money began. What followed was financial chaos. Between 1971 and 1980, the price of gold skyrocketed from $35 an ounce to over $800. The value of the dollar plummeted. Inflation hit double digits, and Americans, many for the first time, began to understand what happens when a currency loses its anchor. Gas prices surged, grocery bills doubled, wages couldn't keep up. It wasn't just economic, it was psychological. People lost trust in money itself, and yet many economists claim that leaving the gold standard was necessary, that the system was outdated, that it was holding back economic growth. But here's the truth. The system didn't collapse because gold failed. It collapsed because the US broke the rules. Under a gold standard, money printing is limited by how much gold you have. That discipline kept inflation in check. It forced fiscal responsibility, and it built long-term trust. But governments hate discipline. They want flexibility, the ability to borrow, spend, inflate away their debts without asking permission. And gold doesn't let you do that. It's heavy, it's finite, and it doesn't care about your policies. When money is backed by gold, politicians can't just stimulate the economy with a press conference and a spreadsheet. They have to make hard choices, and that's exactly why the gold standard had to go. Without it, governments could spend without consequence, at least for a while. But there's a catch, because removing discipline doesn't remove consequences, it just delays them. The inflation crisis of the 1970s wasn't caused by leaving the gold standard. It was caused by decades of overspending that gold had kept hidden. Once that restraint disappeared, the consequences rushed in all at once. So why not go back? Why not return to a currency tied to something real? Something you can't print? The short answer? It's not that simple. The US money supply today is in the tens of trillions. There simply isn't enough gold, at today's price, to back that amount. To even attempt a full gold backing, the price of gold would need to rise to over $50,000 an ounce, maybe higher. And that's just for the US. It doesn't account for global adoption or nations hoarding gold to gain leverage. A return to gold would shift power overnight to a small handful of countries: the US, China, Russia, Australia, nations with gold mines or vaults. Everyone else, they'd be left scrambling to buy gold with paper. And if the US set a fixed price for gold, one below the market rate, foreign actors could exploit the system. Trade dollars for cheap gold in the US, sell it elsewhere, and come back with more dollars. The system would unravel in weeks. There's also the issue of growth. As economies expand, the money supply has to grow with it. Otherwise, you get deflation, falling prices, frozen spending, and economic paralysis. Gold doesn't grow with the economy. It sits in vaults, it doesn't scale. Which means a gold-backed system might stabilize prices, but it could also choke growth. So does that mean fiat is better? Not necessarily, because here's the uncomfortable truth. Both systems rely on belief. Gold has value because we've agreed across civilizations that it does. Not because it powers machines or feeds families, but because it endures, because it resists decay, because it's rare and beautiful and hard to counterfeit. Fiat has value because we've agreed that the government issuing it won't abuse that power, that they'll tax responsibly, spend wisely, and protect its value. One system trusts nature, the other politicians. One limits behavior, the other enables it. Nixon's decision was more than just economic. It was philosophical. It said, we're no longer constrained by metal. We're in charge now. And for a while, it worked. The US became more flexible, more dominant, more financially agile. But in the process, we normalized debt. We inflated bubbles. We redefined money as something that could be summoned with a keystroke. Today, more than half a century later, gold is no longer mentioned in central bank speeches. It sits silently in vaults, not because it's obsolete, but because it's inconvenient. It reminds us of limits, of balance, of a time when money couldn't be printed into existence. By the way, if you're someone who watches the metals closely, don't miss our Sunday gold and silver news recap. Every week, we break down the key moves, central bank buys, insider data, and what it all means for the week ahead. It's fast, it's factual, and it keeps you ahead of the curve, without the noise. Catch the latest one this Sunday, right here on Gilded. And so the question remains, would you rather store your wealth in something real, or in something that disappears when belief runs out? Let us know in the comments below. Real quick, if you're the kind of person who doesn't trust the system, who sees the writing on the vault walls, I made something for you. The first official Gilded drop is live. These aren't your average shirts. They're a statement, a warning, and a nod to the ones stacking metal while the world burns paper. Links below. Limited supply. Because truth doesn't mass produce.